So let's start. I'm just going to briefly introduce Professor Philipsen. We're very excited to have this event with you today. Professor Philipsen is an associate research professor at Sanford, also a senior fellow at the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke. His work is focused on sustainability and the history of capitalism. His most recent research has focused on GDP as the main measure of success in economic affairs. In this work, he explores alternative ways to think about the goals and directions of economic activity, away from indiscriminate growth and toward a more smart kind of development. He has also explored alternative measures for well-being, movements for social and economic justice, race, and race relations. So he was raised in Germany. He has a BA in economics from the College of Economics in Berlin, an MA in American Studies from the John F. Kennedy Institute in the Free University Berlin, and a PhD in American Social and Economic History from Duke. So what we wanted to do today is very much a conversation with Professor Philipsen. If you guys have questions, if you have thoughts while we're discussing topics, please bring up anything that comes to your mind. We very much want this to be a horizontal conversation. So Professor Philipsen, our idea for this chat today is having a space to discuss structural and systemic changes, basically. So we feel like most of the time the discussions that we're having in the policy world and at policy school are focused on incremental changes. But we're witnessing things like climate change, COVID, and these things have been really exposing serious cracks in the global capitalist system. And many of us just don't feel that incremental changes can solve these problems. But this is not a conversation that most of us are used to having, going beyond incremental changes. So we wanted to start from the beginning and hear a little bit about your work. You study how the most basic measure of prosperity, GDP and GDP growth, how those measures are not really serving us. And the current moment that we're going through with COVID raises a lot of questions about that, right? Because we hear about stocks going up and companies doing super well, but people can't even pay their rent. So that very much makes it seem like, the system is not working for most of us. But we also hear that unemployment is so high because GDP is shrinking and that we have to get back on track to business as usual. And that's the only way that we're going to fix this mess. Can you talk a little bit more about how you perceive the importance of growth and all of these debates for starters?
A lot of big questions. So thank you, first of all, for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. And I want to commend all of you for being in an organization like Policy for the People. At a minimum, I think it is fair to say that in this time and place that we need all hands on deck. We need, above all else, creative and imaginative and energetic young people to sort of try to figure out how to get out of this mess we're in. And so it's great. I know that at least, it's probably not very different for you than it is for me that another Zoom meeting and listening to talking heads is really the last thing in the world that you would really want or need. And yet, it is also clear that we need to find some way to be together and to exchange ideas and to sort of see whether we can move things along. So I hope not to talk entirely too much, but sort of give us an opportunity to really engage in a conversation with each other today. I want to start with what may appear to you as a rather oversimplified analogy. But I want to suggest to you that it actually really gets to the core of the problem in many ways and can be really illuminating in a lot of different ways. And therefore also probably keep coming back to that analogy. And the analogy is something that few of you who've talked to me before might have heard before. The analogy is that of a train racing towards the cliff. We are all passengers in a train racing towards the cliff. To clarify, what the cliff looks like, we do not yet know, but it could be climate catastrophe, it could be nuclear war, it could be any number of things. Crises that are imminent if we do not change the fundamental direction of our collective journey. Aline was asking me about my work on GDP. GDP is I wrote a book because I thought that the question of how we fundamentally measure the performance of modern capitalist economies, particularly now at a time where capitalism has become a truly world dominant, a global system. There's practically no country, with the possible exception of Cuba and Bhutan and North Korea, left in the world that is not fundamentally following the nature and logic of capitalism. So I thought that at a moment like this, people who would have spent a lot of time thinking carefully about how to measure performance of this very system. And so when I first got into this, I thought, I would do what, people like you and I always do in a case like this. I do a little basic research and come up with, 27 titles of excellent work on how we do this. And I found nothing. There was not a single comprehensive history of GDP. And so, whatever that was now, 10 years ago, I set out to write this book. And it is still only one of maybe 5 now or so that have been published on that topic. And, I don't know how it exactly has changed the discourse, but I am proud to say that the discourse has changed quite dramatically since its publication on the value of this particular metric. So back to my analogy, the metric GDP is essentially just telling us about the speed of the train. Or more precisely, it is telling us about how much the speed has increased last year. It tells us nothing about the direction of the train. It says nothing about the quality of the train. It says nothing about the quality of life in the train. And indeed, it measures things that by any reasonable standard do not benefit any of us. Another analogy, if I were, say, really frustrated after this conversation this afternoon with you, and I got in my car and I went to a restaurant and I bought a bottle of whiskey and a cigar, and I got good and drunk, and then got back into my car, and as a, white male who has a exaggerated sense of self, think that I can drive in my inebriated state and cause a huge accident involving 4 other cars, injuring 12 people, and so on and so forth. I would have contributed more to the growth of our key performance indicator than I could ever contribute to it pursuing my normal lifestyle. Why? Because GDP measures all goods and services exchanged in the marketplace, completely irrespective of whether these goods and services are good or bad. So divorce is good for GDP, accidents are good for GDP, war is good for GDP, oil spills good for GDP, and so on, right? Freedom, love, kindness, mindfulness, none of them measure at all, right? Indeed, if I were to, let's say, divorce my wife, great for GDP. If I love my wife, terrible for GDP. If I divorce my wife and then hire her back as a nanny for my children, really doubly good for GDP. If I cause an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico and then clean it up, doubly good for GDP. Long and short, and I can talk in great detail about this if you like, it is a performance indicator that values only output, indiscriminate output, as valued by our monetary system. And so one additional thing that I just want to highlight is that it literally ignores everything that we cannot easily monetize in the marketplace. Again, the state of the quality of our governance, the quality of race relations, the quality of equity, peace, the health of our ecosystem. All of these things are completely ignored by the system. And this is not just sort of a marginal problem. This is a core structural defect in the sense that, and you know, you're all very familiar with this as public policy students. As a society, we tend to pay attention only to that which we measure. If we don't measure it, it falls through the cracks. Right? If we don't measure it, we talk about it maybe in church on Sunday or Saturday, or we, you know, read the occasional philosophy book, or we go to an ethics conversation at Kenan. But essentially, for really hardcore, mature people, you know, who have degrees from Duke and Harvard and who have responsible jobs, we don't. So it is a crude and indiscriminate measure, and yet it is absolutely the core metric. It's a probably most likely the most important measure, global measure, that tries to figure out the quality of our performance. That's a problem. And I want to just say one more thing about it, which was in one of the questions that you sent me. The problem is even bigger than a bad measure, because we could, of course, theoretically, and people have tried this before, replace the bad measure with a better measure, like just with cars, right? So the initial cars only had a speedometer. And then at some point, people realized, well, the speedometer doesn't tell me anything about the, let's say, the temperature of the engine. So I also need to have some kind of heat gauge, because otherwise maybe the engine overheats and dies. And so when you now get into a modern car, there are all sorts of gauges. We could do that. The problem with all of these gauges is that they would not affect at all the nature and logic of modern capitalism. I don't know whether you saw in the news, I think it was last week or so, one of the really most sophisticated metrics that is available in the world, called the Social Progress Index. It measures along the lines of many metrics. It's, I think, 170 or so metrics. The quality of life that people have in different places in the world. They do it, I think, every 9 or 10 years. 9 years ago, in 2011, was the last report. Prior to this one, the United States ranked number 18 in the world, I think. We have now moved to number 27 in the world or something. Sort of documenting the tragic irony of people running around, we are number one. Right? And the reason is, of course, that it includes things such as the quality of democracy in America, the number of people we have incarcerated, ecological quality, air quality, right? Safety and travel, any number of things, and you know, very fundamental things like access to good healthcare for everyone, race relations. And on many of those, we not only are pretty bad, we are in some cases the worst pretty much in the entire world. In terms of percentage of people we incarcerate, we're literally number one. There's no fascist, totalitarian dictatorship anywhere in the world that is worse than we are. The problem with all of these metrics is, however accurate and good they are, they do not at all. And they don't even inform, much less shape, public policy making when it comes to the economy. Let me clarify this another way. Politically speaking, people ask me, am I a liberal or conservative? And I go like, neither. I mean, aside from the fact that given that we're 330 million people and that you give us the choice between two parties, which I just find pathetically insane, that's not a choice. I want to also point out that on fundamental critical issues, there is actually no difference between those two parties. And the one thing that I just wanted to highlight is this question of economic growth as measured by GDP. The difference between Democrats and Republicans, to the extent to which it exists at all, is about how best to achieve GDP growth, not whether it is good, not whether it is feasible, not whether it is sustainable. Right, so if you were to come to the conclusion, as I have over the last 20 years of research, that growth, the continued exponential growth on a finite planet, is a suicide pact, I have no political home. I have nowhere to go. I literally have nobody to vote for. And this is, of course, reality in almost all highly developed, and I mean, actually, almost all countries anywhere in the world. So this is the tragic irony of this moment in history for you in particular as young people. You can literally open up any reasonably decent newspaper, and you see articles that show that scientists warn that climate change, global warming, resource depletion, extraction is getting out of hand, that it is reaching possibly irreversible, dangerous levels. And on the other hand, you have a column celebrating that we have once again achieved economic growth. And hardly anybody ever thinks to say, wait a minute, those two are connected. That's the same thing. We're celebrating on one hand what we're bemoaning on the other. And of course, you can't fix climate change, resource extraction, depletion, without talking about economic growth. So some people are beginning to realize that this is not exactly news anymore in the scientific world, though most public policymakers and virtually all economists basically live in the world of denial on this very question. Right? They still think that within the growth paradigm, we can fix all these other things. And what they have to show for is literally nothing. There's practically no evidence that we can somehow create something like sustainable growth or green growth or absolute decoupling or whatever the terminology of the day is. And so my last point along those lines is that what is needed is a new operating system. The very DNA of capitalism, the very logic, nature and logic of the system is driving the train off the cliff. And I think that we might need to think about this a little differently than talking about incremental versus structural or reformist versus revolutionary or whatever terminology we use there. Because really, in essence, it is a question of whether we are taking, however small, steps in the right direction or in the wrong direction. whether we're moving towards fundamental transformation of the systemic logic. In that sense, I am immensely grateful to the activists, particularly of Black Lives Matter, who have, in my lifetime, for the very first time, allowed this culture to have a meaningful conversation about structural change, structural problems. And what is true for race is true for the climate and for capitalism, right? To say that I'm not a racist is just simply not enough. It doesn't even begin to get to the underlying problems that a white supremacist reality of 350 years has left behind. So you have to be, at a minimum, an activist anti-racist. The same is true with capitalism. A carbon tax here or a cap and trade there or any of those things, I'm not opposed to them, right? Let's have another racial equity workshop. I'm not opposed to that. Let's add social corporate responsibility to an otherwise terrible mission plan. Sure thing, let's do that. It's better than nothing, by all means. But to believe that it actually gets to the core of the problem is a simple delusion. Right? And in that sense, it is radical to say that, but radical only in the sense that radical means going to the roots and not stopping at the surface, not just scratching the surface. And so what that will require, I do not know. But it is certainly clear inequality is probably worse today than it has ever been in human history. We now have 8 people who own as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the world's population combined. Power is deeply, deeply, deeply entrenched. And as, if nothing else, the example of Exxon shows very clearly, even when people know that they are a criminal, when their own in-house research shows them that they are massively contributing to the existence of climate change, they, when push comes to shove, decide to go with lying, cheating, and stealing rather than with the truth of historical, academic research. So the barriers are profound, no doubt. But it is also important to remember that the 4 billion people who have less wealth than the 8 really outnumber the 8 by a long shot. Right? And that there's very little that can stand in the way of organized people. Policy for the people, right? Power for the people. And this is no joke. This is the only thing that we have. And we have the better ideas, but that alone is not enough. What we need to do is organize as people. And as organized people, many, many times in history, we have accomplished amazing things. In fact, I want to leave you just with that. I mean, not leave you. I want to end my beginning introductory remarks with just sharing with you that my first book was written on the collapse of communism. And I was, as an early environmental activist, interested in what then was called dissidence in the Soviet sphere of influence. And so in the summer of 1989, I traveled to Eastern Europe and interviewed dissidents. And one of the questions at the end of my interviews, I asked them, do you think that the Soviet Union, that communism will ever collapse? And they literally looked at me like, what? They thought this was the most preposterous, crazy, stupid idea ever. And then they always said something, I have it on tape. They said things like, well, certainly not in my lifetime. In November of 1989, the wall collapsed. By 1991, communism had literally disintegrated and is now a distant memory in the lives of people like you. If that can happen, the same can happen to neoliberal capitalism, which is now in as much crisis as communism was in 1988. I want to leave it there and see what you think. Questions, comments, responses?
Thank you so much. You touched on a lot of issues that I've been thinking about. I'm a first year MPP student, and so, you know, part of my journey to graduate school is about a sort of what I see as a lack of imagination among people in power. The idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And
Noam Chomsky.
yeah, or Frederick Jameson, unclear, right?
Oh yeah, well, that could also be. Right.
But, you know, and something that I struggle with and that we've observed, you know, with climate change and with the racial justice issues in particular, is the ability for, you know, for them, these issues to be distorted by capitalism, that, you know, climate change becomes a personal responsibility rather than a systemic issue that needs to be addressed on, you know, with the major resource extraction companies, or, you know, the same where after George Floyd, I was really not surprised, but disappointed at how quickly companies came out and started, you know, spewing just that they cared about Black lives without making any actual, like, real commitments to change. And I'm just, you know, wondering, both from you and from my colleagues, what kind of strategies can we use to break that imaginative kind of deficit and really push for bigger, more substantive ideas?
Wow, that's a great question. And I do want to hear from others what your ideas might be. I struggle with this myself, and I struggle with this as a scholar and a teacher a lot. I want to suggest a piece that I use in my classes, the only piece that I have used for like 25 years now, which is a piece called Defending Against the Indefensible. It's short. It's written by Neil Postman. And
I read it for Wesley's class this summer.
Yeah, she got it from me.
Yeah.
And so what it essentially argues, among other, it argues in the tradition of people of which there are more, like, you know, John Dewey or Paulo Freire or many others, that education really should be pursued as a defense against culture and not a defense of culture. And of course, I certainly was not a product of that kind of education, and I would bet that none of you were either. Mostly what education is people who obviously don't have the answer trying to tell us that they do have the answers, and teaching us all the tools that, as Postman would put it, introduce us into the prejudices of the old. And so it is really, it's easy and flip to say, think outside of the box. But most of us don't know, what does that mean? What do you mean outside of the box? What is the box? And, and what's the outside look like and so on. And that's a real problem. The only partial answer I have to that is to disinvest from the illusion that what we live with right now, it makes any sense. Right? Or not, to put it more dramatically. As a scholar, as I sit here right now, the only thing for which I have an overwhelming empirical case to make is that the only thing that is unrealistic, the only thing that will not work is to continue doing what we're doing. It will just lead to more shit. More sexism, more racism, more inequality, more war, more violence, more extraction, more colonialism, all of it. And this should, at a minimum, then give us freedom to explore some real alternatives. And so disinvesting yourself from sort of the psychological need to be part of something that works when it clearly doesn't, is, I think, an absolute necessary precondition intellectually and psychologically to ask further reaching questions. And I readily confess, if you want me to put some skin in the game here, I give you two examples of, from the smallest to the medium size, of how difficult this is and how sometimes the most obvious things in the world we don't understand simply because we grew up differently. So the most basic example, I'm now a homeowner. I raised 4 children. I have a house with a yard. Every fall, what did I do? I raked or blew all the leaves together, bagged them up, and put them on the side of the curb. Then I read this piece in some kind of environmental magazine that said, think about what leaves are. Why do trees have leaves? And where do trees get their nutrients from? And what do leaves do to the soil? And so what you should really do is get rid of the grass, because grass is just a disease. It's a colonial British, stupidity. And let the leaves be on the ground and, nourish the ground and nourish the trees and nourish the plants. I mean, it's about as obvious as it gets, right? It's like 1 + 1 is 2. And yet I had never thought about it. And it required somebody to say to me, well, why don't you look at it this way rather than do it the way you've always done it? A somewhat more significant example would be to talk about cars, for instance, right? I grew up loving cars. I knew cars. I knew how to fix cars. I love to drive. But the minute you take a step back and imagine life without cars, I mean, we saw a little bit during the first weeks of COVID, neighborhoods that were actually quiet, people on the street, kids actually being able to run around and play. So from any perspective, cars are horrible for the environment. They're economically horrible. They're weapons. They kill people, something in the order of 40 to 50,000 every year. They're incredibly inefficient. Something like 88% of the time they sit somewhere on the side of the road. We dedicate, on average in America today, more space to cars than we dedicate to people. Think about that. We have entire cities in the United States of America that are literally built around the needs of cars, not around the needs of people. The minute you begin to think about that, it is so insane that you just literally just no longer know how did we ever get there? And of course, you can do this with practically every issue. And so back to your question, Natalie, I don't know, but I think that doing those kinds of exercises and doing it for each other and helping each other and guiding each other is the only way to do it. And create out of all of that critique of that understanding of what's wrong, a vision of something better. And I think that's possible.
On that, I just posted a quote by a famous Brazilian educator that's been under attack from the extreme right in Brazil. And he says that when education's not freeing or liberating, the oppressed stream is becoming the oppressor, which is exactly what we see as in, oh, so we need more, minority CEOs. And yeah, that would look great for that company, but what does that do for structural change? Maybe the system that company thrives on is the problem. It's not just, what their internal structure looks like. And those are very difficult questions to ask. For example, I think most people know I'm from Brazil, and there was this one president a while ago, and there were lots of problems related to his government, but at one point he had a very interesting quote related to GDP, like we were discussing before, which was he was being criticized by a few economic measures because of a few economic measures, and he mentioned, but people don't eat GDP. I am putting food on people's tables, and that's the most important thing to me. People don't eat GDP, and of course the market went crazy. The market is this ethereal thing. The market is that was an entity of its own. Of course, hated that, and it's something that we can see that we can criticize that, but we don't know how to get around it because everything that we're taught is that these people's lives will only improve if they have jobs, and for them to have jobs, the economy needs to grow. But, there is so much wealth that we could somehow redistribute. But then that's when people, I feel like we don't have a framework to think about that, because what is it? So it's not working under this capitalist system in which all the wealth is monopolized. So what is the alternative that we have? We've heard of socialism. We've heard that didn't work. And then there's people using that term that don't necessarily mean socialism, but they use that because they have that as a reference of what is not capitalism. So just all of this confusion, in our heads. I don't know what's the conclusion of my comment here, but yeah.
Okay, if you keep talking, my head is gonna explode. Because you're raising so many wonderful questions. Very briefly, so Paulo Freire probably was talking mostly about the fact that the most effective form of power is for the people who are oppressed to buy into the logic and the thinking of the oppressor. And, Soviet communists were always envious of Americans for that very reason. Like, most Americans believe things like that we live in a democracy, that we have freedom, that we have real choices. Right? And the minute you begin to believe that, of course, you no longer, we don't need jails, and we don't need secret police, and we don't need anything anymore because we have captured your mind. So in that sense, Freire is certainly right that the most effective form of power is to get into your head. As a historian, I would say that socialism has never existed. And so as a historian, I know, nobody knows what socialism really is, but socialism originated with a very simple proposition. It was the proposition on the part of working people who said, we produce the wealth, but we don't get any of it. And the people who don't produce any wealth get all of it. There's something wrong with that. So at a minimum, those who produce the wealth should also get a good part of that wealth. That was the basic idea behind socialism. Okay? And I think COVID, again, really opens up a window of possible insight. And I just, at the risk of over dramatizing this or oversimplifying it perhaps, it allows us to see what are essential jobs. The people who provide the healthcare, the people who teach the children, the people who take care of the old, the people who deliver the food, the people who grow the food. That is essential work that is necessary for our well-being. And I don't want to be flippant, but it seems to me pretty clear that if we had all the marketing and consulting and law firm, corporate law in particular, and all the advertising and so on, people stop work, nobody would have noticed. Unless life just got a little better, maybe. Right? And in terms of payments, it is inverse proportional to how essential you are. So quite possibly the most essential work that anybody could do in this economy is to be taking care of little children, raising little children, our future, literally our future. Those people make, on average, what do they make? $28,000 or some damn thing. It's pitiful. But if you work for Goldman Sachs or Bain or any of these completely superfluous places, you make millions. How is that possibly defensible, right? And I'm sure I'm forgetting things. The most problematic thing that you raise as a question, it is true. Bad things happen when GDP doesn't go up. But why is that? It's not because we don't have the work or we don't have the wealth or we don't have the goods. It is because of a systemic logic that requires capitalism to grow or go into crisis and recession. Does that mean that people, in order to be well, in order to thrive, in order to prosper, need to have an economy that grows? Absolutely not. In fact, my research suggests that as of probably 2010 or so, the costs of growth were greater than the benefits. Growth now causes more damage and causes more poverty than it actually provides benefit to people. So it's not even about redistributing, that's part of it. It is understanding that, and I have huge difficulties with most of my colleagues on this for obvious reasons, understanding that real development can absolutely happen and can probably only happen outside of growth and not within growth. That development and growth is not the same thing. Unless you measure development by growth, which they oftentimes do. Right? Then it becomes a tautology, a self-fulfilling, circular prophecy. But so what is development? What is it that we need, right? What we need is, among other things, more efficiency. What we need is probably less of a lot, right? And so redefining that and creating a system that doesn't need to grow. the logic of growth within capitalism today is the logic of the cancer cell. It too needs to grow until it has domesticated the body and killed it. Which again, as far as analogies goes, is pretty much exactly on target. Yeah. And is that possible? Of course it's possible. That damn system that we have that requires growth is what? Maybe, depending on place and circumstance, somewhere between 80 to 150 to 200 years old. There's absolutely no reason to believe that we need to continue this. Much less that it is the best or the only system that ever, you know, whatever. All these promises and claims that neoliberals make. They have absolutely no foundation. I see frowning foreheads. That can't be right. That guy must be crazy. Matthew.
First of all, thank you so much for speaking to us. And
can you speak up a little? I have a hard time hearing you. Yeah, okay.
I was too laid back on the couch here. So the thing I just keep thinking about for myself, and how like incongruent our economy feels with like our general well-being right now is personal example. During the pandemic, I actually got laid off from my job. Since I got laid off from my job, the retirement account the firm set up for me has gone up by nearly 20%, even in a time of great suffering and economic depression. And it's just unfathomable to me that these economic indicators that we think show national economic health, like they just don't line up with what's actually going on. Like I'm very fortunate in that like I'm probably got like a top 2% outcome among people who have lost their jobs, but there's just so much suffering, like mile-long food lines, and it's just so frustrating to still hear leaders talk about how the fundamentals of our economy are strong, and once we get past this next wave of the pandemic or in a few months, we'll be back to normal. And it's clear to me now that like we can't go back to normal on so many levels.
And normal was not normal.
Not at all. Not at all. And I'm just sort of synthesizing what you said with my experiences, both like as someone affected by the pandemic and as a Black man in America. I'm just thinking about the conversations.
Absolutely.
What I've seen this summer, and how like the thing I keep thinking about is how I feel like we focus so much on individual blame in this country and fault, that's almost a way for people in power to ensure that we don't focus on like the big systemic structural changes we need to make. And I think when I think about race, for example, that's something that I try to keep in mind as much as possible. That's just my reaction to what you've been saying so far.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. I mean, at the risk of taking on too much here, but and you know, I would not call myself a socialist or a Marxist, but if you read Marx, if you read any Marx, anybody who's ever read Marx would not be surprised why the stock market is looking great while the country is in the shitters. Because the stock market doesn't measure the quality of the country or the quality of the economy. It measures the return on investment for rich people. And so, you know, the most obvious example, even pre-COVID, is that the higher unemployment, the better for the stock market oftentimes, because it raises profits. When the unemployment is higher, wages go down. With wages go down, when wages go down, labor costs of companies are lower. If labor costs of companies are lower, profit margins are higher, right? There you have it. I'm in the shitters and their profits go up and the stock market looks great. But Matthew is also sort of, everything he just said about his job and COVID and being Black in America today is sort of, can all be used in order to show how it all literally comes back to capitalism. And, I mean, at the risk of totally oversimplifying this, Africans were brought to the Americas not because these white folks were racists. In fact, they didn't even know yet what race was. They were brought over in order to exploit people and to exploit them in ways that were, just indescribably vicious and brutal. And without even paying them anything. And the people who did that were landowners who had tried it with indigenous peoples, and they had tried it with Irish people, and right, and the people with whom it was most profitable were Africans. And only when they started doing that, and then it became super immensely profitable. And how profitable it is, if you want to know about that, I give you plenty of literature that literally the foundation of wealth in America was built on the enslavement of Africans. Only when they realized how fucking profitable this was. And here I go. Sorry, this is on recording. I didn't say that. That was a French word. Just came to my mind. How profitable this really was, did they then feel a need to institutionalize this? And how do you institutionalize this? Most of these people were Christians. How do you justify to yourself enslaving fellow human beings? The only way you can do that is come up with some ridiculous theory as to why they are less human than you are, like maybe 3/5, right? That was the origin of the very idea and the terminology of race. So this logic of profit over everything else, of exploitation of people, of exploitation of other nations, of exploitation of resources in the name of profit, that is ultimately what the problem is here. And when you think about it, again, just aside from all ideological aspects, that we organize entire complicated societies that have different cultures, different belief systems, different people. We organize them around one overarching goal, and that goal is not love or peace or kindness or understanding. No. What is that goal? That overarching goal? Profit. Seriously? I mean, the minute you begin to think about it, it's literally, it just boggles the mind. It is so insane that somehow, most people, when they first understand it, go like, no, that can't be true. Wait a minute. It's got to be more complicated than that. But it's not. And the things that we do and that we construct in the name of this system in order to justify that system and rationalize that system is all the things that we're talking about here, including race, including anti-immigrant sentiments, and of course, including male domination, right? What is male domination other than having women do all the necessary labor in order for capital to happen without paying them? That's what male domination is. You raise my children, you take care of my parents, and you fix my food while I go out and make profit. Right? Absolutely. So it is a systemic issue. It's not just changing our attitudes about something. That's never going to make it happen. Racial reconciliation cannot happen in America until we address that question. And as long as white people just simply sit on all the privileges that they have accrued over 250 years and all the wealth that comes with it and say, oh yeah, okay, now I get it. I won't be racist anymore. It's like literally James Forman, the former civil rights leader, always compared that to, a 10K race where, for the first 15 minutes, somebody's shackled to the starting block. And then you unshackle them when you say, now go run. Now you have equal opportunities to win the race. So of course not gonna work. Can't ever work.
I know we're pretty much out of time, so I don't want to keep anybody, but I guess I'm curious if you can share any examples of models of meaningful divestment from capitalism. I always find it helpful to kind of see what someone else has done and visualize like what I could be doing or what we could be doing together.
I wish I had a simple answer for you, but so part of the problem of the broadly defined left historically over the last 150 years is the realization that in a global capitalist system, you cannot build anti-capitalism and succeed. And so the best you can do is sort of build limited models that have very limited reach in terms of telling you what an alternative might look like. What you can do is work on components of what the alternative would have to look like. And so here you find probably today an unprecedented number of people and initiatives and organizations working on really amazing models and understandings. Whether these are people in Scandinavia who are building eco-villages, or whether it is people who are working on ways to implement a universal basic income guarantee, or whether this is people who try to figure out what companies would look like that are worker-owned and worker-controlled and worker-run. Right, so, and I could go on and on and on and on. There are so many really fantastic ideas and models out there of how pieces of the eventual larger puzzle could function. I am personally part of an organization that I invite you to check out, which is an international organization that has set as its goal to try to create a story and narrative and program around building a alternative to extractive capitalism called the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. We call it Wellbeing Economy because we just simply our starting premise is that any economy worth its food should focus above all else and primarily on well-being of people and planet, right? Not on profit and growth and extraction. And so there are lots and lots of people and organizations part of that umbrella organization, all of whom work on different aspects of what this well-being economy could look like. So I'd be happy to talk to people about specifics there on many, many examples like that. And of course, for me as an educator, I cannot help. I mean, maybe I'm too biased because I'm an educator myself, but I cannot help but think that initiatives like yours, Policy for the People, demanding also from other faculty members and from curricula committees that are thinking about, what kinds of courses to offer and how to structure programs. I mean, why, for instance, is there nowhere at Duke a place where you could go and learn from people as to how to build a fundamentally different economy? Right? There is nothing that specifically addresses what an economy would look like that is decoupled from resource exploitation. There's nothing that teaches you what an economy could look like that meets the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. Nowhere. And this is at one of the best universities in the world, where you have, you know, the most resources that you can possibly imagine. And we do not need some of those most fundamental requirements. I mean, to Matthew's question, you know, how many people are at Duke seriously investigating what racial equity would look like? There are a few people. You have one here at Sanford, Sandy Darity. He's very seriously looking at that, and he has come up with a very credible and very serious proposal for baby bonds and so on and so forth, and is articulating the possible goal of reparations. But, you know, that's like tiny minorities. The rest is all just sort of, you know, I don't know, saran wrap on a pile of poop. Right? Not very serious business. And so who would demand that? You should demand that. This university depends on you. You are our future. You pay our salaries in large part. Right? And it can't happen until you demand it and say, look, we don't want to be radical. We don't want to, you know, be annoying to you, but could we at least have a course on X, Y, or Z? My God, who wants to know about cost benefit analysis? We got accountants for that. That's bullshit, right? I don't need to know about that anymore. That's primitive. Let's talk serious business. Let's talk vision. Let's talk structural change. What would that look like? Right? On housing, on transportation, on energy, on governance. We still teach you politics that assumes that the nation state will continue to exist and that somehow politics happens between Republicans and Democrats. I guarantee you that in the next 20 years, that will fundamentally change. I guarantee you that people will realize that, you know, we need to have much better local governance and much better international global governance, right? And that the nation state, the way it is currently constructed, is an anachronism. It doesn't work anymore. How about we teach a course on open borders? Give all earthlings equal opportunities. Now that's serious business. Let them move wherever they want to move. Let them be as free as capital and goods already are. Wow. Right? That's an idea. And you know what? It's probably more realistic than the bullshit that we're doing. Closing down borders and, you know, incarcerating children and taking them away from their parents. Seriously? All things that you can demand, that you can bring on the agenda in every conversation. Right? So Gabriella, think about what you think is important. What are some of these issues, and where, and then look at people and courses currently available, whether they adequately address this. And if they don't, hey, how about, could we perhaps, please? Right? We're shrinking in numbers. I see this. I must be really engaging. It is lovely to see everybody. I hope I get to talk to some of you some more. It's too bad that we can't see each other these days. I'm beginning to get very tired of Zoom. But as a high-risk person, I unfortunately am quarantined at home.
Thank you so much, Professor. This is, like you were saying, these are the conversations that we need to be having and understanding what we want to see more of. And I think, yeah, this was really, really illuminating. Thank you. I don't know if anyone else had anything else that they wanted to say just as we're finishing up.
I just wanted to say thank you as well. felt like, in addition to being illuminating, it felt validating. It feels validating to know that you're not you and your views on how things are right now. Like it feels like that's where we should be thinking, as if like that nothing is working, like the normal isn't working.
So Matthew, remember, right? Good people are always the minority. And we don't really need more than a minority. No revolution was ever fought by more than 3 or 4% of the people, right? And the vast majority of people will always go along like lemmings. And when I look at the Trump electorate, you know, it may also be that some 30 to 40% are just, I don't want to use any terminology as long as the recording is going on. Beyond the pale, beyond description. But so being in a minority should not mean that we don't do the work. And the wonderful thing about this moment in history is that there are, you know, minorities of people doing really, really incredible, kind, powerful, creative work in every damn corner of this world. I mean, I can travel around and, you know, I do sometimes, or, you know, prior to COVID, I did. And you find them everywhere. And it's just so inspiring and so amazingly empowering. And so those are the people I want to hang out with. I don't want to hang out with the suits because they have nothing interesting to say. It's all predictable stuff. Not interesting to me. So keep up the good fight.
Professor, are you going to be teaching your class next semester, the Wellbeing Economics course?
No. Which one? You mean the one that was cross-listed for graduate students too?
Yeah, that one.
I mean, I'm a little overwhelmed right now. I mean, so I mostly teach undergraduates because I think that they will probably in the long run have a bigger impact and are more accessible to that kind of learning. And what I generally teach is once a year, I teach a capitalism course. It's a basic history of capitalism so that you learn as to how this system really works. And the other one that I teach almost every year, and I'm teaching this semester, is called Denial, Faith, and Reason. And it's about sustainability, what that is, and what it would mean and what it would require if we take it seriously, which most people don't. Most people, when they use that word, essentially are just talking about a little less unsustainability. They don't really talk about sustainability. And so the Wellbeing Economics course was a Bass Connection course. And I you know, it'll depend on students organizing some demand for that. I think in order whether I can teach that again. I would love to do it, but the response was not overwhelmingly good. Just not enough interest. It was a little too far out there. Any other comments, questions? Evan, I haven't heard a single word from you. How are you doing?
Doing well. Just intently listening and you know, taking it all in.
Well, you know, let me know if you have any feedback, thoughts, ideas.
Professor, I had a little question about, you were recently talking about the nation state being an issue in terms of capitalism and alternatives with open borders. Do you think that smaller self-sustaining towns and communities are more conducive to economics of well-being and more socialist tendencies, as opposed to a giant country where Exxon can have profits in one space and pollute in another, and people have to drive 30 miles to get to work because they want to live in the suburb? And do you think that that's like a reasonable thing to pursue?
I would give this a tentative yes. I mean, it's certainly absolutely essential when it comes to sustainability. It is probably a very good idea when it comes to more participatory democracy, right? Which is important. So it's a governance prospect of high relevance. But it goes back to Gabriella's question about alternatives to capitalism, which is that if you build a lot of reasonably well working eco villages around the world, this does not in and of itself change the fact that we live in a capitalist hegemony. Right? And so that DNA logic, that nature and logic of growth and extraction still needs to be addressed. And eco villages themselves will not do that. They give us models as to how to do it possibly, and they might provide ideas as to how to scale it. And therefore I am absolutely 100% in support of them. But they themselves will not get us to the point of dislodging that structural flaw of the system, if that makes sense. All right. Poor Matthew had worked with me for a while, and he was like variously fascinated, irritated, and put off by all of these ideas.
I admit it, yes.
Huh?
I admit it.
Does that roughly capture it?
Yeah, I'm one of the people who drank the Kool-Aid for a long time, you know.
And are you coming out from under, or are you drinking some more Kool-Aid?
I'm taking this equity class, and it's like a whole new different version of like sort of similar eye-opening stuff, but just less focus on sustainability and more on race and health and stuff like that. And I feel like working with you prepared me for it.
Good. Yeah. Right then. I never got to see Natasha and Jen. So without visual acquaintance, nice to have seen you as black boxes.
Sorry,
Oh, there you are.
it's just been spazzing in and out.
Sounds good. Did you hear anything that was thought-provoking?
Yeah, I mean, all of it I think is thought-provoking. I feel like the part that you said just about like asking Duke for more education towards these different types of ideas is like really important. And I feel like there's so much, like, you know, just the idea of even moving away from capitalism is like hard for me to at least think about, because I've grown up, you know, in a society that admires it. And I guess when I think about alternatives, it's hard for me to imagine what the alternatives are. And I think that just contributes to like the whole educational system being pro-capitalism and not having the background on like, even like when I feel like having discussions and like, you know, maybe arguing that this isn't correct, I always feel a little like, not dumb, but just like, oh, I can't express what the next step is because I just know that it's wrong, but then like I don't know what the alternative is.
Okay, so you're giving me the perfect launching pad for a final comment before I let you go. I hear you loud and clear, first of all. You are where I once was. Capitalism is literally the water and the fish tank in which we all swim. And it is very difficult to even begin to know what that means, what it might mean to question capitalism. I would not want to, I would suggest that you don't get hung up on the word. And I'm also not arguing that we need to give up all aspects of it. When I teach capitalism, at the end, we come to the conclusion that it was probably the best thing and the worst thing that ever happened to human beings. But there are aspects of it that are absolutely vital, I think. But so my final thought to you would be that whenever people begin to critique something seriously, and whenever we start talking about possible alternatives, a almost overwhelming standard response is something along the lines like, that ain't gonna work. Show me the models. What's that? That's totally unrealistic, right? That's ridiculous. How's that supposed to work? And so my suggestion to you is to ignore all of that. Just simply not pay attention to it, and above all else, not engage in it yourself, because it is intellectual suicide. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this for a very pragmatic, logical, intellectual reason, which is, if you want to fix a crisis or problem, you need to understand what causes it. So let's first of all just simply look at, based on good evidence, what are the causes of the problem? Whatever problem you care about the most: racism, sexism, inequality, climate change, war, whatever. And then think about what would have to happen in order to fix those problems. Not just make them look a little better, not make them a little more amenable, but fix them. And only then start talking about and thinking about, okay, so how do we do that? And then do whatever you can think of in order to get you there, without getting sidetracked by this question of what's realistic. That's my intellectual reason. My political reason is, and I think I said it already before, a little earlier, the only thing that we can currently demonstrate to be the most unrealistic, utterly, completely, totally unrealistic, is to continue doing what we're doing. If you don't believe me, show me one sound intellectual work, academic work, that makes a convincing case as to how exponential growth on a finite planet is sustainable. I'll pay you good money if you find me one, because I looked far and wide and I didn't find a single one. Right? So if what we're currently doing and what all the mature people with all the degrees and all the Brooks Brothers suits tell you is clearly not realistic, right? Then, well, maybe alternatives, and maybe even radical fundamental alternatives, might be more realistic, right? So the capitalism that you grew up with, and the capitalism certainly I grew up with, is no longer viable. And here, my last analogy for you to work with. My first one was the train racing towards the cliff. My last one is, imagine a starving patient coming to the doctor. The doctor says, how many calories are you taking in every day? And the starving patient says, 250. And the doctor says, oh my God, that's just simply not enough to live. Let's double that to 500 calories. Patient comes back a week later with 500 calories. He's still not feeling very well. The doctor says, but you're looking better. You're definitely better than last week. Let's double it again to 1,000 calories. Patient comes back and is almost well with 1,000 calories. Doctor says, let's double it again to 2,000 calories. When the patient comes back with 2,000 calories, he's fit, he's buff, he's doing well, right? Patient says, the doctor says, wow, this is really working. Let's double it again to 4,000 calories. This time the patient comes back and he's like pretty big. He's beginning to have some problems with blood pressure and heart rates and all that kind of stuff. The doctor says, hey, don't worry about it. It's been working so far, seriously. Don't be a naysayer. Let's double it again to 8,000 calories. At which point the doctor will kill the patient. And that is precisely where we are with modern day capitalism. Right? Growth worked for a while and it was good for a while. But now we're killing the patient. Now we're literally pulling out the rug from under the existence of humanity on this planet. That's insane. And we should see it for what it is, and we should just simply take a deep breath and say, okay, time to move on to a different model. That's my encouragement to you. Be well. Power to the people. See ya.